All on.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Lardy. I've got the privilege of chairing the Fargo-Moorhead West Fargo Chambers Agribusiness Committee. So welcome to our committee meeting this morning. Today, we've got a panel discussion about the future of transportation. But before we get into the panel, let's go around the room and do a quick round of introductions. So, Amy?
Morning, I'm Amy Macbeth with BNSF Railway.
I'm Denver Oliver, the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute at North Dakota State University.
Todd Pringle, Deere and Company.
Joel Swanson, Steffes Group Auctioneers.
Keel with the chamber.
Eric Wadibank, North Dakota.
Joe Hellman, Merrill Lynch.
Let's go to our online participants. We'll start with Mary Christie.
Good morning, everyone. Mary Christie with Congressman Armstrong's office.
Scott?
Morning, Scott Zalonda, Cornerstone Bank.
Harrison?
Harrison Weber, Red River Valley Sugar Beet Growers Association, out here in Gale Township, where it's unfit for man or beast today.
Nancy?
Good morning. I'm in Houston, so the weather is much more pleasant.
Brenda?
Good morning, Brenda Elmer, North Dakota Corn Growers Association.
Keith Peltier? All right, Brandon?
Brandon Baumgartner with the North Dakota State University Foundation.
Levi?
Levi Otis with Ellingson.
Are we missing anybody else online?
Yeah, Keith Peltier here, and Harrison is a wuss because I drove out to Amenia from West Fargo this morning.
Oh, that's north of the track. South side down here, south side's tough, man.
Well, welcome everyone. Welcome back to winter, I guess. So we've been kind of lulled into a false sense of security that winter in Fargo is 61 degrees and beautiful. And it's not quite the case this morning. So this morning, as I mentioned, we've got a panel discussion on the future of transportation. And so our participants this morning are Amy Macbeth with Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad and Denver Tolliver, who directs the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute at North Dakota State University. And I'd like each of you, we'll start with Amy, but just tell us a little bit more about your company that you represent here today.
Sure. Good morning. Thank you. I appreciate all of you. And it is nice to be home. I think I'm based in Minneapolis, but I'm from Valley City originally, actually, and went to what was then Moorhead State and have a kid at NDSU and lots of family still around Fargo. So spend a lot of time here, but I have worked for BNSF for about 12 years now. I handle public affairs, so the eastern half of our network, and BNSF, for those of you who don't know, is the biggest Class 1 railroad in the country. We are the major hauler of agriculture commodities and ag products. And we have about 1,100 employees in North Dakota, and obviously this is a significant part of our network from between Chicago and the PNW on what we call our Northern Transcon. So really looking forward to the conversation today, and thanks for having me.
Denver, tell us a little bit about Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute.
Yes, thank you, Greg, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to see everyone this morning on this beautiful North Dakota morning. The Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute is an interdisciplinary research technology transfer institute at North Dakota State University. We got, I think, 41 FTE, somewhere along those lines. We usually fund about 40 to 50 students. We are funded directly by the state legislature, but that's only maybe about a third of our funding. So most of our funding comes from federal grants, the North Dakota Department of Transportation, which is a really great partner to us. So freight transportation's always been a really critical part of our portfolio, particularly focusing on agricultural transportation and energy. In addition to the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute, I'm also the director of the Federal Region 8 University Transportation Center program. And in addition to NDSU, we have University of North Dakota, Colorado State University, University of Colorado, University of Denver, University of Utah, Utah State University, Wyoming, and South Dakota in our consortium. So we've got a 5-year funding guarantee from USDOT, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things we're doing later on.
Thank you both. So let's start with a question relative to, if you could just step back and kind of describe the major forces that are affecting the transportation industry from your perspective.
Sure. I would say the way that we look at it at BNSF is sort of whatever's grown on that acre of land in North Dakota and Minnesota and wherever else, we want to be able to move it. So whatever form that comes in, we will figure out a way to work with our customers to move that. And so, whether that means increasing our shuttle facility capacity, working with our customers, whether it's ethanol, obviously with the crushing facilities. So whatever the advent is for our customers, we're looking to grow with them. And I think when we think about our agriculture business, we have seen a lot of growth over the last 10 years in particular. I mentioned earlier, we are the biggest hauler of ag products and ag commodities. And so we're really focused in terms of how we can continue to grow with our customers. I think the other forces that you see, and I think we'll kind of get into a little bit, is labor and workforce issues, not unlike everybody probably in the room and on the call. That will continue to be, I think, a challenge for us as we operate in a 24/7 environment, as you know. So gives us some particular challenges in terms of recruitment. When you look at who railroad employees are, many of them are generational. They had a father or an uncle, a grandfather, second, third, fourth generation employees. So we have that very strong tradition, but we also are running into, again, what a lot of folks are on that. I think the other we'll get into it as well, but regulation is certainly something that we're spending an awful lot of time talking about today, and sort of safety and how we communicate that moving goods by land is really the safest way and the most efficient way to move the commodities that you all and we all need every day. So that's a whole big bucket, Dr. Lardy, but those are kind of the things that we're seeing right now.
Denver, how about from your perspective?
Well, I think the big four are the workforce, as Amy talked about, the labor shortage, automation, inflation, and infrastructure funding. Automation is a driving force in this country. It's almost an inevitable outcome here in certain areas of transportation. I realize that highway side may be going a little bit faster than the road side. But the cost of infrastructure, cost of operations as a result of inflation have just been almost unprecedented, causing unprecedented issues. Not just in the trucking industry, but in the construction sector, road building and agencies. And a huge concern I'll talk a little bit more about going forward is infrastructure funding for highways. Right now, there's a lot of money out there, but we have some huge long-term issues, a lot of that resulting from inflation and over budgeting. But those are the big four that I see.
Let's talk a little bit more about labor. Amy, from BNSF's perspective, are there particular sectors of your business where you see the labor crunch more than others, or talk a little bit more about the labor issues?
Yeah, well, I mean, and for many people who know, I mean, we're a little bit different in terms of our union workforce. And so we went through a big bargaining round the end of last year, and 2 years ago, I guess now. And that will continue to be a challenge for us. Through collective bargaining, that process is coming back around again. But we definitely have pockets that are harder to fill or to keep. So right now, the PNW, for example, is a bit of a challenge. And so we do things like, of course, like everybody else does, hiring bonuses. We'll temporarily move folks and work with them to do that, to try to fill in where we can. Of course, when the Bakken was really, really hot, we had a difficult time competing against those companies for labor. So it does sort of depend, I think, on what's going on, what else is happening regionally for that competition. We also, I should say, we have a really good ability to recruit and retain people with military experience. That's a significant pool of employees for us. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Folks will say railroading is an outdoor sport, highly on a day like today. We need to be reminded about that, but also very safety sensitive. So folks who come from the military make really, really good railroaders. So we, like everybody, are focusing on folks that we can, and then also things like trying to get to people before they're in college, or even before they are maybe thinking about what career they want to have. I mean, the great thing about working for the railroad is if you're just talking about, if you want to be a conductor, an engineer, a welder, the vast positions that you can have, we'll train you. You don't have to have a degree. We'll train you. And so we think that that's a good message to continue to have. And then, of course, folks might be surprised to hear that our TS department is our second largest department. And we have an amazing amount of technology. We're recruiting people, the same students that are maybe going to go work at Google. And if you look at, and we'll talk a little bit more about the amount of technology that we're leveraging and that we're using, we have a big demand for those types of folks with that kind of experience. So it really runs the gamut in terms of what we're looking for. And obviously from a customer standpoint, we're really focused on, for example, the PNW and what we can do. Now, the other part about that is everybody else's labor challenges also impact us. So, as many of you know far better than I do, we have elevators that are consolidating because of their workforce challenges. We have, any other number of customers that are having trouble retaining and recruiting, and that certainly impacts them as well as us from that standpoint.
Denver, you mentioned in your opening comments some of the infrastructure challenges, and the federal government has implemented a couple of key acts recently, Inflation Reduction Act and the American Rescue Plan. But talk a little bit more about some of the things that are in those particular bills. What does that mean for transportation infrastructure in this region, and what are some of the continuing challenges?
Well, we have this unprecedented short run burst in funding. There's tremendous funding in the Department of Transportation. For one thing, they have so many programs that there's a notice of funding opportunity always open at the DOT. And of course, the North Dakota Department of Transportation is applying for a lot of those funds. Some of those funds local governments can apply for. There's one in particular that we did apply for townships, and that's the Safe Streets for All program, and that's coming around again, and we may go for that. That's strictly targeted at local government. But the North Dakota DOT has several. There's a smart infrastructure grant program that probably next time around we may be collaborating with some of the NGOs in the state. So just an incredible amount of funding out there. So the short run is a situation where the federal agencies are trying to get the money out the door. they have so much money, and it's almost an overload in a way. And so some of the states and localities are kind of struggling with applying for those fundings. And in fact, several agencies have reached out to me to want us to kind of be a facilitator to help, particularly tribal and local governments apply for some of those fundings. Now, that's just on the Department of Transportation side. There's even more money in the Department of Energy for clean energy transitions. And a lot of that does affect transportation. There's a huge push for electric vehicles. We're benefiting from electric vehicle infrastructure funding coming into the state. But in addition to that, there's all kinds of Department of Energy funding out there to want to bring rural and tribal communities towards a clean energy transition. And again, they're wanting us to help facilitate that. So those are just two of the federal agencies, and you're probably aware that agriculture may be in the same situation. And some of the funding is time limited, so they got to get it out quickly. So short run looks good. However, this is also propelling inflation, and inflation is the flip side of that coin that is very troubling. Now, the rate of inflation has come down overall, but still in some of the construction sectors and some of the material sectors, it's high. But the flip side of the coin too also is that we just can't spend that kind of money. We just don't have it. And so beyond this 5-year program bill that we have now for transportation infrastructure, there have to be some very difficult questions answered, like how to fund highways in an electric vehicle world. Even though we say we're multimodal, how do we have multimodal financing to help regional railroads? So those are some big challenges that we have to deal with. So short run, great. Inflation bad. Long run, we've got some real problems we have to deal with.
Amy, would you talk a little bit about how does BNSF partner with local communities or state agencies with respect to some of these programs that are out there for infrastructure financing for transportation projects?
Yeah. So as a Class 1 railroad, we're privately owned and privately maintained. So everything that we're plowing into our infrastructure is from us, right? But we certainly do partner with state and local agencies, and with the bipartisan infrastructure law and all of that funding, it's really important, just like what you were talking about, Denver. We've kind of switched a little bit at BNSF and have really ramped up our ability to help local and state applications for the enormous amount of funding to really be able to help some of the, what I would call kind of legacy infrastructure problems. So, when all of us are trying to get to work or pick up our kids and you come into contact with a train at a grade crossing and, you might be frustrated. You're lucky here in Fargo, you have a number of underpasses, but there's a lot of just sort of legacy conflict with two modes of transportation. And while we can certainly do what we can on the operating side to try to stay off those crossings, for example, there are lots of opportunities for trying to kind of deal with those longstanding issues. And 42nd and Grand Forks is a perfect example of that. That's one of the first applications that was successfully funded to be able to grade what we would say grade separate, create an underpass or an overpass on 42nd. And what we're doing is hiring, frankly, engineering firm to help with those local applications where it makes sense from a public standpoint and from a private standpoint, where we can increase our ability to serve customers more efficiently, and the motoring public can safely traverse either, like I said, for overpass or underpass. But there's also a number of other grant programs to increase mobility and to be able to create efficiency from an economic development standpoint. And so those are really, it's a bit of a sea change for us to really ramp up our efforts to help where it makes sense on those applications. And I think that's really important. The other thing I would say that just to get my pitch in here, we're going to see a lot of conversation about passenger rail, and a lot of funding federally is coming down on that. In North Dakota, obviously, you all have Amtrak. I don't know if anyone has taken it from here to the PNW, for example. And Amtrak in the western half of the country operates on freight railroad tracks. If you are in the Northeast, they have some of their own private tracks there, but for the most part, operates on freight railroads. Now, BNSF operates commuter service as well in some locations. If you've gone to Chicago and you ride the Orange Line, for example, that's BNSF Railroad, and it's our employees who operate that, and it's called a parade. So when during the rush hour, no freight rail moves and we move passengers. And it's a significant coordination, as you can imagine. And same with Amtrak. When Amtrak has a schedule to meet and we have a service plan to meet for them, so freight rail takes a second seat to that. So as we have conversations throughout the country and increased interest in moving people, and freight railroads are the sort of easy place to look for that, we'll engage certainly in those conversations. And with Amtrak, we absolutely will. But it's really important for us to think about from a customer standpoint, and for you all in this room to understand and have those conversations. I would love. We just got to make sure that A, it's in the vein of safety, and B, for capacity to serve our customers today and into the future, because once we lose capacity, we're never going to get it back. And that has to be the priority for us as we have these conversations moving forward. And so we're seeing a lot of that. We'll see a lot more of that, just given the federal funding emphasis on increasing passenger movements.
Amy, in preparation for the panel discussion today, you provided me with a little bit of background data that was actually very interesting. So for the past couple of decades, talk a little bit more about how the volume of ag commodities that you're moving with BNSF through the Northern Tier has grown, and some of the advent of shuttle loading facilities across the network. What has that meant for BNSF, and how you're adjusted to accordingly?
Yeah. So I don't know if I'm assuming everybody is probably familiar with our shuttle network or how shuttle trains work. I mean, it's essentially a designated train that has designated power, designated locomotive. So it's really a way to increase efficiency. And we, BNSF BN, started it a couple of decades ago. And I think it's an important story for North Dakota as we think about value added agriculture. And I talked a little bit about that. Whatever is going to move and evolve, whatever's going to evolve in terms of what North Dakota is producing, we want to move it. But it's also really important to look at the growth of grain products and grain in North Dakota over the last 10 years. Almost all of the growth in agriculture commodities moved by freight railroads has been on BNSF. And some of that is just, where our network is. But a lot of it is our commitment to growing with our customers. And so a lot of those shuttle facilities, Ray, North Dakota is a great example I can think of right off the top of my head. They were, stood up 20 years ago by now, and they're at the point where they're reinvesting or they're expanding their capability. And I just think it's a great story when you think about the number of shuttle facilities in, if you look at the map, it's really just this very dense corridor in the mid-continent, and North Dakota is squarely in the middle of that in terms of shuttle facilities that we have helped with our customers be able to develop. And along with that, what happens is destinations have increased. And so it's not just the front end, it's the back end. And for us, that growth looks increasingly like Mexico, for example. And so how do we help get exports to the PNW, but also other places where our customers wanted to go. So I think it is a really good news story when we think about everything else that's happening in the ag sector. There's also an awful lot of continued growth on the grain side with our shuttle customers.
Denver from the perspective of, if you think about the growth in the shuttle loading facilities, in order to get grain to a shuttle loading facility, you need a network of roads. So talk a little bit about that network, some of the infrastructure that's required at the township and county level to make those shuttle loaders possible efficiently.
Yes, well, first of all, I'd like to give a big shout out to our legislators who have stepped to the plate the last 10, 12 years and provided a tremendous amount of funding for township and county roads that just not exist before, and came up with, not only did they put money into the North Dakota DOT, they enacted legislation like Operation Prairie Dog, which makes funding available to counties and township for road funding. So, and we actually track that over time, the conditions of the county and township roads. First started doing those studies, the average pavement condition of paved roads has increased. Funding for gravel roads has also increased as well. So first of all, big shout out to the legislature and anyone who's been responsible for promoting funding in rural roads, because it's often kind of a forgotten thing. You know, people just don't even think about it. They think the truck's going to show up at the elevator and it's going to go up by rail, but it's got to get there. So a couple of important things there is that the material cost for roads has gone way, way up, as I mentioned before. And so for an X amount of dollars, then we can only repair and maintain so many miles of road. So at some particular point, there's going to have to be at the federal level a discussion about how we finance roads in the future. And as you're aware, most of the road funding comes from fuel taxes. And when we go to electric vehicles, right now there's a discussion about how to charge electric vehicles, assess them for road use. We're not there yet. We just don't have a working model. Absolutely. And it's going to fail miserably in the next 5 to 10 years. And we're going to have to come up with some new financing mechanism. So what is that? We don't really know. What I don't want it to be is an assessment of user charges on farmers to haul goods into elevators. And we absolutely want to stay away from that. So we need to look for some very innovative financing and funding mechanisms as we go forward. So just in summary, right now, I'm sure some of you could always point out roads that you think could be improved, but I think just in general, our road condition has improved over the last 10 years, and we're probably in good shape relative to most other states. But we do have some long run issues, and we do need to pay attention to it. One of the things that we're doing is trying to automate condition assessments out there, because of the workforce shortage. It's very difficult to go out on a very regular basis sometimes and go over these 60-some thousand miles of, local county and township roads we have out there and assess their conditions. So what we've been doing for the last 10, 15 years is we actually run all of the roads in the state, off the state highway system, every year with dash cams and sensors in the vehicles, smartphone sensors. And we have automated the road condition assessment data. Now, we can only afford to do that once a year because of the cost. But we do need to look at more cost-effective solutions and how we can automate road condition assessment data.
I had to look at my notes if I can go back. So just to give you an example of the actual growth that you talked about. So in the past 10 years, we've had a growth of about 200,000 units a year from egg products and egg commodities. And then if you talk about shuttle loading facilities, in 2000 we had 69 origins, and today we have 263. And if you talk about the destination side, in the past 20 years, we had 28 destinations, and now we have 118 destinations. The growth in Mexico, I mentioned as well, but it's significant growth. And if you look at all other railroads compared to BNSF. I think, again, it's really just in recognition of where our network is and the ability to grow with them. So I had to look at my notes though.
That's okay.
That.
It's an open book test.
All right, good.
Yeah.
Amy, Denver mentioned that the push to renewables, and talk a little bit about, BNSF's perspective in terms of not only needing now to move renewables through the network, but also the push to transition the railroad to other forms of energy in the future. So talk a little bit about those two forces that are at work.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, exactly. We'll be working with customers to move the oil, to move the meal, for example, as well. And then, like everybody's business, we have, we're trying to figure out how best to reduce our emissions. And we do have a target of reducing our emissions 30% by 2030. So first, I should say, moving stuff by land is the most environmentally friendly way to move things. Makes sense. So if you're an environmentalist in Minnesota or someplace else, California, you should be a big supporter of the railroad and right here, of course, as well. But we spent a lot of time talking about that. That how do you incentivize and move more commodities by rail if one of your objectives is to reduce emissions? So for us, how do we get there? It's through better locomotive technology. So we're working with our locomotive manufacturers to figure out where we can, what the right blend is that we can do in terms of biodiesel and renewables. So we're continuing to test that and work on that. And then beyond locomotives, it's really the renewable fuel function. And if anybody's been involved in any of those conversations, we're going to have a hard time meeting the demand when you look at railroads as a huge user of diesel. And then you talk about sustainable aviation fuel. How are we all going to have all of what we're going to need for renewables? So we're focused certainly on that, and then in the longer term, we're testing things like battery electric locomotives, hydrogen locomotives. That's a bit further off for us. We've already done some testing in California with battery electric locomotive for us. So if you think about the network and the way that railroads work, the capacity from a battery standpoint is just not there yet. So it'll be that's definitely a longer term play, and we see renewables as definitely the bridge in the near term and for the foreseeable future.
Denver, will you talk a little bit about you mentioned earlier on some of the things that you were studying at Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute, but let's dive a little deeper into that. What are a couple of the current studies that you're working on that are key for transportation infrastructure here in the state?
Well, with our federal University Transportation Centers grant, we're focusing on the automation of surface transportation infrastructure, inspection, planning and maintenance, and using a variety of sensors out there, as well as data from drones. And so one of the things that we're doing is partnering with the Northern Plains UAS test site, Department of Commerce, University of North Dakota. And so we're really looking at what beyond digital line of sight, how can we deploy drones, harness that data, combine that with data with sensors in the pavement, near the highway, these environmental sensor stations. And by the way, those ag sensors are very, very useful to us. And so we blend all that data together, and we're writing artificial intelligence algorithms, primarily to take all that data. We do machine learning and then come up with some solutions to automate decisions. Now, when I say artificial intelligence, some people get a little nervous, but we're really using it for decision support types of activities, and it's just really critical to us, and it's critical to the future of transportation. It's also critical to autonomous vehicle operations, and I talked about them a little bit earlier. We have some quasi autonomous trucking going on right now in the state. MnDOT is running a leader follower type of truck where it's actually a remote control. It's not autonomous. The driver in the lead vehicle can control the second vehicle. And that's work, but we're pushing forward then to level 3 and level 4 automation, and level 4 would be fully autonomous, but not in all conditions. Now, there's some real challenges for autonomous trucking in this country. Right now, one of our collaborators is Kodiak Robotics. It's one of the leaders in the nation. They're going to run totally autonomous in Texas over Interstate 45 this year. They're going to remove the safety driver, but they have mapped that road. They have run it many times with their sensors in their vehicles, and they have this incredible digital mapping capability. That's not happening up here for a while. So we've got some infrastructure investments to make. We've also got challenging winter weather, but it's going to move north. And 2 or 3 years from now, then we're going to have autonomous trucking companies like Kodiak. They're trying to solve some of those problems and get into it. The other big thing is electric vehicles, not just battery electric, but fuel cell electric vehicles. And as Amy knows, California has gone to this electric vehicle sales mandate. You won't be able to buy any trucks and terminal vehicles in California after 2035, I believe it is, by that aren't zero emission vehicles. And so by 2050, I believe all of vehicles will be transitioned out of the fleet so that it's all a zero emissions fleet. And so right now, when they say zero emissions, they're thinking electric vehicles, not thinking renewable diesel. So that's not in the zero emission key point for many of these people. But then there's also a big move to hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and the trucking industry is looking at both of those options. In fact, we participated in a conference last year, and the outcome of that conference was the trucking industry wants to look at all options. They are moving ahead with electric vehicles. There are a lot of electric trucks on the market. There'll be more electric trucks on the market, but they would also like the option of renewable diesel and using renewable diesel in the short run. So we don't know about that, but that's a big part of our research program that's going on right now. And I guess I've gone longer on this than I intended to, so I'll stop right now.
Amy, earlier on, you had mentioned one of the classes of employees that you're competing for is scientists and engineers like you'd hire at Google. So talk a little bit about how BNSF is using artificial intelligence, machine learning, some of those technology features to improve safety and efficiency of the railroad.
As soon as I start talking about AI and machine learning, we're all in trouble. But I can tell you what is the outcome of that, right? So I think when you think about the railroad, the only thing that is the same is the steel wheel and the rail, right? And beyond that, the locomotives are these massive computers that are moving down the track. And in all seriousness, we are leveraging technology, and we're going to continue to do that. And we're doing it obviously for 2 reasons. From a safety standpoint, it has dramatically reduced the number of incidents on the railroad because we just have a better idea of what's happening on the railroad, and more and more in a predictive nature versus being online and having a wheel, a broken wheel, for example. We're using wayside detectors, and a lot of people have probably heard a lot about wayside detectors since the East Palestine incident in Ohio. And I'm happy to take any question. I should have said at the outset, any question from anybody on any of this, but we've actually had trackside detectors for a couple of decades on our railroad, and it's not something that's been regulated. It's something that railroads figured out really good for business from a standpoint to be able to monitor the equipment that's moving across the track. And so these trackside detectors take 35 million readings a day. And here's where my technical expertise this is shown. It's mashed up, right? And they can figure out through the algorithms what might potentially be a problem. And so there's various levels of alarms, and one, the highest level being the crew gets an alarm and they need to stop their train immediately and get out and inspect that, versus, next stop, let's pull that out, versus let's take that wheel out and maintain it and look at it before it even gets built into a train. That's been hugely successful in terms of our ability to reduce incidents on the railroad. Another example that would probably be of interest to you all as well is we're using AI to figure out how to better switch cars, for example. So it used to be whoever was the best guy, the yard master, would figure out, this, you have 50 cars in this track, 50 cars in this track, and you need to combine, 40 of them to build an outbound train. And, as you can imagine, there's as many different variations of how you could do that you could possibly come up with. And through these programs now, we're figuring out how to do it much more efficiently and much quicker. And so if you can build a train in 30 minutes fewer, and you have 10 trains, all of a sudden, we get back to that sort of capacity question. You're starting to build a lot more capacity and you're a lot more efficient. We hear often from our egg customers can you just figure out when your train is going to come? Because I'm, again, a workforce that has to come to be able to load that train within a certain amount of time. Can't you get better about how, what that estimated window is going to be? And sure enough, that's another thing that we're looking at, pulling in all those different data points to understand what the dwell is going to be at this terminal and what the impact is going to be. And if we can get that ETA to a smaller window. So it's a lot of really exciting things, and things that we probably wouldn't have realized just a few years ago, but it's making a big difference. Like I said, both on the safety standpoint, but also on the efficiency side. And I think we're only just going to continue to see that advance and grow. And when you talk about autonomous trucking, that's one of the challenges that we're going to have. I mean, you have a railroad that operates on a set track. Now that we have positive train control, another form of technology that uses the information from those wayside detectors that can actually stop a train if it's over speeding or if it's a misaligned switch. We're going to leverage PTC even more in the coming years to figure out how to move trains in a block and more efficiently. Now, we're also going to hopefully be able to remain competitive if you have autonomous trucks. And, we're seeing, we have a crew of 2 people in a cab of a locomotive, and you have an autonomous truck on a roadway that's funded by taxpayers. So trucks are our biggest partners, but also our biggest competitors. And so, obviously we're going to continue to use technology to remain competitive and be able to do that safely.
For our audience members, we do want this to be interactive, so please be thinking of your questions if you've got some questions for either Denver or Amy. Amy, talk a little bit more about, as you look back of the past few years, especially through the pandemic, some of the supply chain issues that were faced. How do you go about balancing the supply chain issues, and also, you see this growth in demand, you've got more shuttle facilities moving egg products, demand coming out of the Bakken for moving crude oil and other products. Talk a little bit about how BNSF is addressing the capacity issues across the system.
Well, I think, and we've talked a bit before about the supply chain and the challenges, and the other part of BNSF's business that's folks may or may not know is consumer products are well over half of the volume that we move. We're making significant investments in our railroad in Southern California. Obviously always been a big important part, but I think the the pandemic and some of those federal grants that Denver mentioned go to ports. We should have mentioned that. So really sort of laid bare some of the challenges. And if you think about the increase in population and the fact that, you know, we're all ordering from Amazon, that comes eventually, initially at some point on a train. And we want that to happen, right? So I think we have done things like increase our capacity in a number of ways. So how can we, like I said, build that train faster and better if you're in a logistics park in Chicago? How can we in North Dakota add our capacity? In 2014 and 15, we really saw a significant growth, not only just in consumer products, but obviously in crude oil and ag, as we talked about that growth. So for us, how do we add capacity? It's through adding track. So if you can add double track or triple track, that's what we're going to do. We did that in North Dakota from Minot West. We added about 100 miles of double track in 14, 15, and 16 and collectively. We've added sidings in North Dakota since 2014, I think. I can't remember now if it's 11 or 14 different siding projects. That's where we either added, built a new siding or extended the length of the siding. So those are ways that we can add capacity. But ultimately, it's pretty difficult to lay down new track. So we have to look at, from a technology standpoint, how we can get more from our assets. And I think based on what we have done in North Dakota and elsewhere on our Northern Transcon, we have done a good job of trying to add additional track where we can. Sandpoint Bridge is a good example of that. And we'll continue to do that where we can. But we also have a significant challenge on permitting some of these projects in different locations. And I think that's something from an infrastructure standpoint that the agricultural community really needs to pay attention to. And we can get into that more. But I think that as we move forward, it's going to be more and more difficult to build new. And now we're seeing even replacing existing is pretty challenging. So that's something we spend a lot of time educating and talking about.
Let's pause here and see if there's questions from our group here, either online.
I got a question for Denver.
Go ahead, Harrison.
Hey, Denver, do you know, when we replace roads or we got road construction out there, whether it be a county road or what have you, are the standards of road building changing? I mean, when my grandpa was a kid, we'd haul 100 bushels of wheat, and now we're hauling 800 bushels of wheat. Are those road standards, like whether the subgrade or, the concrete PSI or the rebar or whatever that goes in there? I mean, are we making new roads, or when we completely replace a road, are we upping the total weight that can be transported on that road?
Yeah, over time, highway construction has improved greatly with the need to handle heavier loads. And so you were talking about some of the lighter loads in the old refining days. Now we have on a regular basis 34,000 pound tandem axles and 16,000 pound single axles going over roads. But one of the things that's been happening on the paved road, I'll talk about that first of all, is the asphalt materials have been improving. But not only that, our understanding of when to make improvements to the roads has grown scientifically over time. And so now the North Dakota DOT and the counties all have a playbook. What's expected life cycle of our paved road, given the traffic base that we have right now? What type of maintenance preservation improvements do we need to make at the right time to make that road last 20 years? And then what overlay thickness do we need at the end of that 18-20 year period to extend that life on to another 20, 30, 40 years? So yes, the materials are improving, and right now there's a lot of research going into even better materials, particularly on, I think on the asphalt side, that are going to make the roads a little bit longer. There's been some discussion of people, and I don't know if maybe this was, you were hinting at this, is that why don't we build more concrete roads that will last longer, they'll last 40 years. They cost a lot more up front. You know, that's the big problem associated with the concrete roads. And so what we try to do for our rural roads, the farm to market roads, is we look at how many of those can be asphalt roads primarily. How can we improve the condition of those roads over time? And so, yes, the materials have improved, the science has improved, but the cost of the materials has improved. So I don't know if I've.
Great to hear, except for the cost. I don't like that, but great to hear.
Other questions from our audience?
Yeah, I have a question on the regulatory environment in North Dakota. I understand, I can get my head around what permitting, like anything new is, struggle anywhere. But why is replacing? What are the regulatory challenges or other challenges to keeping?
Right. So, I mean, we're a federally regulated industry, right? But those regulations involve a lot of steps, right? So if you look at, for example, we have a bridge over the Missouri River in Bismarck and Mandan that we've been working to replace really since the end of 2017. We've been in, it took 5 years to get the federal permit to replace the bridge. In that, when you talk about inflation, in the time it took to get the permit, the cost to build the bridge, and it's a replacement bridge, went up by $40 million. So because of the, the way that is set up, you have the ability through the Section 106 process, through the NEPA process. It's a long input discussion. There was a small group of community folks who wanted to save the bridge. And so now it's in litigation. Unfortunately, we had a Supreme Court ruling last week, I guess. So we've been able to construct the bridge through the process, but it's a very onerous and very expensive to be able to go through what is essentially replacing existing infrastructure. So when you talk about permitting reform at the federal level, the things that we would be interested in would be reducing those timelines in terms of when you get a permitted decision. In this case, we had to get the bridge construction permit from the Coast Guard. So we went through, just to give you an example, I think 22 consulting party meetings led by the Coast Guard over a 4-year period. We take that very seriously. We bring in our bridge engineers, we bring in our permitting folks. We have a conversation about what could be done. Is there an ability to save the bridge? Could you build further away and keep that existing bridge? Again, it's our infrastructure, we own it. What's the impact to doing that? Then you have to increase the cost of the project that you want to build by another $100 million. Those are the kinds of things that we're facing. And I would say that's surprising in a state like North Dakota that's open for business, that understands the importance of moving commodities out, no matter how you do it, right? So we didn't anticipate that, to say that nicely. But that's part of, we follow obviously the federal regulations, and that's the requirement.
Is it a larger? Just a highway. So a bridge or it's rail.
I wouldn't say it's a larger burden, but I would say the expectation, I would just say, this is an editorial comment for me, the expectation is interesting when you're talking about private infrastructure versus a highway that's a public asset. Having said that, that's the federal regulation, and if it's if it has historical significance and it's going to be an impact, then, that's the regulation. So can you do something differently and save that structure? Who would own it then? Who would pay for that? Who would pay for the increased project that we would then have to build in order for that to stay on our property? So those are the kinds of things. When we start something like that, if we have an ability to do that, then that's also a conversation. But if it's going to cost another $100 million in the project we want to build, the regulation says it has to be feasible and reasonable. And, we would say, and the Coast Guard agreed, that it's not feasible or reasonable to be able to say you have to build something that's $100 million more than you want to build.
A huge problem are the lawsuits, even after this regulatory approval, particularly for new construction. Now, many of you may not remember this, but the Dakota, Minnesota and Eastern Railroad was going to build a rail line from Wassa, South Dakota into the Powder River Basin to move coal directly to the Mississippi River. And there were investors that were going to invest in the railroad. Well, it didn't take very long to look at the economic justification because it was very short. Wow. But the environmental review took 5 years, I think, at that time. They got shorter, but it was 5 years at that time. And then the court challenges after that took another 5 years. And so by the time the STB finally came back after the court charges, the investors were gone. I mean, who's going to stay around and invest money in something like this? And as Amy said, that's private capital going into railroads. And just a recent ongoing case right now, the Uinta Basin in Railway in Utah, that was approved by the STB. 81-mile new rail line construction went through incredible environmental permitting processes. The draft environmental impact statement, which I didn't read it all, but I scanned it, was like 1,100 pages. And then the final one was 1,500 pages, 30-some meetings. And then the third parties challenged in court. And so it's in court right now and being challenged, and it'll be just keep being challenged again by the environmental defense funds and some of these others. So that is just a huge problem. The litigation after the approval extends the permitting process. Sometimes it doubles it.
The challenge that we had, that we got from the Supreme Court recently, was a challenge to a state permit. And again, we've been able to construct while that's happened, but that challenge came from a group that was involved in the 20+ meetings that we had as a part of the project. And there's also, you have 6 years after the federal permit was issued to challenge the NEPA process in court. So, the bridge will be built, the old bridge will be removed, and, you still conceivably could challenge that permit. So, and then we can talk about another example in North Dakota, the DAPL pipeline's another great example. I mean, permitting certainty, yeah. I mean, how will we ever get any infrastructure constructed and built, replaced in this country when that can happen, right?
Kaylee, you had a question
I
online?
think Levi, I'll go to Levi first.
Hey, I had a question. Maybe it's for Denver. State Senator Larry Luick out of Richland County has a bill on road trains. I was just curious where we're at with that, and if you know, and kind of what you see as the future of road trains in North Dakota, and how do they work? I suppose you have to have an agreement with states outside of North Dakota if your road train is going to cross a state line, but can you touch on that a little bit?
Right, yeah, and there's also the issue then of if the road trains are going to operate over federal highways, and that's not a grandfathered configuration, then there has to be federal permitting. So the road trains in the configuration, at least that was talked about there, would probably have been restricted to county roads. But what has happened is a sort of a pilot set of roads that has been set up by the North Dakota DOT, where twin 48-foot trailer trucks can be operated on. That could be a growing traffic volume in the future. We just don't know for sure. I think this leader follower concept that that Kratos Defense has innovated here in North Dakota makes a lot of sense. And I think there's going to be a legislative clarity in the next session that would allow the safety driver to be removed from the second vehicle. So there you've got two 48-foot trucks operating in unison with one driver. And so that's always been the big push for the road trains. It's not so much been the capacity payload, although that is a benefit, but it's also been the fact that we just can't find enough drivers for the farm trucks and the agricultural trucks, and that's not going to go away. Now, will level 3 or level 4 autonomous trucking take away the demand on that as well? It probably could. But I just think in the configurations that were discussed, these very long trucks like they are used in the outback in Australia, that's a really difficult proposition in North Dakota. It's also difficult from the standpoint of roadway geometry. And you have to have a lot of articulation units in a very long vehicle like that before it can corner and get around. But I'm not certain. The bill could come back this time. But I think in a broader sense that we are moving towards larger truck configurations, and we are moving toward the leader follower concept that will be in essence a platoon, a quasi autonomous platoon that will operate.
If I could just add to that, I don't think we have anybody from the short lines here, but one of the things that I think is interesting about that is going to be, again, getting back to that sort of modal equity and what that would do for the short lines operating in the state. Again, there you have a privately funded railroad that is then going to be competing with a road train on a publicly taxpayer funded roadway. And I think that is going to be, and then possibly without a second person in that truck, excuse me. So I think that when we have those policy discussions, it'll be really interesting to hear about that, because I think the short lines are incredibly important part for this community, and something to just keep in mind when those discussions happen.
Yeah, I just had a question. You talked a little bit about the overall federal regulations, but talk a little bit more about the state regulations and how, especially BNSF, how you navigate some of those. I think of specifically like the ruling out of Washington for for transporting oil. Kind of talking how to navigate that, and obviously it kind of handcuffs what you're able to do in the capacities. So just talk a little bit more how you navigate that.
That's a great example. So you're talking about really what we see is states trying to regulate what would move or not move. And in the case of Washington State, they have some very specific agenda that happens to conflict with what we here in North Dakota want and need to move out to markets. And so, excuse me, that's really, when you look at the railroad system, that's why we're federally regulated, because pretty soon we're going to get in a situation where Colorado's going to decide, or Washington's going to decide. I mean, Washington could say it's cold today, but maybe tomorrow it's going to be tennis shoes. I mean, who knows, right? We don't know the next best thing that we're going to find here and that we're going to figure out how to make money from and transport and get it to another market. And so it's really important for us to be able to continue to lean on why we are federally regulated. It's because of interstate commerce, and we're not going to be able to move anything if we have individual agendas by state. And what that's looking like, in addition to Washington State, more recently, what we're seeing in some states is through the guise of safety regulation, for example, to say either we need to mandate how many crew are in a cab of a locomotive, or we need to say those trackside, wayside detectors that I talked about, trying to regulate the spacing of those, when you need to stop a train, when, all the things that are really operating, get to the operations of a federally regulated railroad. So we're spending a lot of time talking about the importance of that and the ability to move that, because we're not going to be able to, move a train through North Dakota and then stop at the border in Minnesota because Minnesota says you have to have 2 people in a cab of a locomotive. If eventually we can figure out how to do that with one crew member through collective bargaining with our union employees. We used to have 5 people that rode on a train. And for a long time, we had a fireman that stayed in on the train. There was no need for a fireman because we didn't need them anymore. So we want to try to figure out how to redeploy employees and use them in different ways as technology advances. But that's just one example. I mean, we're never going to be able to move goods in any way in this country if we have individual states coming up with regulations that they see that fit their agenda. So it's really important to continue to have that framework, and we'll continue to obviously talk about that a lot.
Levi, you've got a question online.
Yeah, sorry. Denver brought up autonomous trucks, and it's interesting to me that the railroad has to have a few people on a train when, you know, there's not really any left or right, and it seems like a regulatory burden. Now I know it takes a long time to stop a locomotive. That makes sense. But even with trucks in North Dakota and the conversations we're having about autonomous trucks, you know, Grand Farm's right across the street from you, or their office, and that's the direction we're going. But you can go to Arizona, jump in a Uber without a driver, and then they drive you around one of the busiest cities in the entire world, right? Or at least in the country, with, you don't even think about it. But here we're desolate and we're wide open roads, and it's like an argument to have an autonomous vehicle. I don't grasp the whole regulatory conversation on it, other than they're just bigger and heavier. But what do I know?
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, let me just talk about what Amy said. The railroads are ideal for automation. I mean, the vehicle's on a guideway. It doesn't need anybody to drive it. And with positive train control, we have automatic stopping capabilities. We have also, so automation on freight railroads is really an easy path forward. It's a little more challenging on highways, because particularly in our part of the country, because of the varied conditions, the weather, climate, things like that. But I guess one of the things that I have noticed is people tell me there needs to be a public awareness campaign to kind of get the public thinking about the fact that they're going to be on the same highway with an autonomous vehicle. And what does that mean for them? How do they react? Can the autonomous vehicle react? So I think it's a transition process, Levi. And I think we're going to get there. We're going to have to get there. But I think our transition here is probably going to be a bit longer than it will be elsewhere. Now, Amy talked about the balkanized regulations across the states, the inconsistencies. That's the same thing with autonomous vehicles right now, is that some states allow great flexibility, like Texas and others. California actually had legislation passed to mandate a safety driver in the autonomous vehicles, and the governor vetoed it. But so it just kind of shows you there's this great variation across the United States right now in terms of legislation, what's allowable. There's just so many things that we don't know too. The state patrols have got to adjust to this. For example, how do you investigate a crash scene where there's an autonomous vehicle and a driver controlled vehicle? Who's responsible for the autonomous vehicle? Is the owner of the vehicle? Well, sure. But how do we work through those things? And in some cases, Levi, there may be remote drivers for some of these autonomous trucks that are monitoring the truck. They actually have the control to take over the truck. Okay, so if there's an accident, a crash, who's responsible? Is the remote controller? We don't know the answers to that yet. So it is a transition process, and I know robo-taxis are out there and they're doing their thing, and it's great. I think people get a little more concerned about an 80,000-pound truck on the road maybe than they do a vehicle. So I think there's some acceptance to that. But I would also like just to talk, if I could, about the unbalanced regulatory and funding situation that Amy mentioned. And I've talked a lot about trucks, most of the time about trucks and highways. But from an agricultural standpoint, the trucks are going to move the goods to the rail line. That's the role of the truck. I mean, even if we have all autonomous trucks, and even if we have platoons, the distance at which they're going to be competitive with railroads is going to be 500 miles or so. Okay, so we have to have BNSF move the ag goods to the PNSF and to move soybean oil and other goods like that into the clean fuel markets in California. And Amy talked a little bit about the cost and energy comparison. Right now, if we're talking diesel fuel locomotive and a diesel fuel truck, those unit trains, we would measure fuel efficiency on something called a revenue ton mile per gallon. So how many net tons can you move on 1 gallon of fuel? Well, the railroad's average, they publish is maybe, I don't know, 450 or something like that. But those unit trains, I've modeled those on flat terrain, good terrain, that's maybe 750, 800 revenue ton miles per gallon versus 100 to 127 for an 80,000 pound truck. So there's a tremendous fuel efficiency advantage associated with railroad transportation. So I'm very much, even though I've talked trucks, automation, electric vehicles, I'm very much agreeing with what you're saying is that we have to look at the impacts on railroads, and we have to have a better multimodal policy in the United States.
Oh, you had a question? Denver, I don't know if this is a relevant question or not, but do you ever foresee a time when there's almost dedicated roadways for autonomous vehicles or self-driving vehicles where you have 2 lanes that are dedicated to those or you know, something like that? Do you see that in the future?
Oh, I absolutely do in metropolitan areas. That would increase the highway capacity amazingly. And so if you look at these congested freeways and you look at the movements, you look at the stop and the start, the way the drivers react, different driver movements, you know, fast acceleration and braking. So you can just imagine what would happen if you had a lane of autonomous vehicles, you know, in sync going down the lane. It would greatly increase capacity. So I think it will. And I think there will, like in Southern California, I would be very surprised if there aren't dedicated autonomous truck lanes leading into and out of the ports and connecting in between the ports and the rail yards.
So, excuse me, feels like I haven't talked to forever. So we talk a lot about efficiencies, and we're talking through, you know, okay, we want to streamline if we're going to put in new railways or anything like that. What are we seeing on existing lines or lines that are no longer in service? The roads and the rails been removed. However, that's still running through the middle of the field. It's still running through the middle of the town, and it creates more headaches. And I'm aware of multiple situations where farmers have reached out, and it's a years and years process, and they say, well, now I've got a letter sitting on a desk in Chicago, and I've got nothing back to me, and I'm just trying to either buy the land so I can move it out of the way, or I'm just trying to be able to farm this again. This that's really just try it back to the land. It's no longer a useful infrastructure for railroads or for roads. We're seeing some of that in North Dakota on pushback on the energy renewals too. Prime example is wind turbines. In the new leases, if the wind turbine company goes belly up, well, they're not going to come get the wind turbine. It is now the farmer's responsibility, and now it's an eyesore, and it's a headache for them to work around. So is there a movement or anything when an infrastructure is no longer efficient or no longer serviceable, that it's getting moved back to farming or an entity that's actually able to use the land?
Yeah, I'd be interested if you have specific locations, and we can certainly talk about that. I mean, from a railroad standpoint, because we're federally regulated, there's a very specific process. So if you're talking about a line that's been abandoned, that's a specific process that has to go through the STB. So if that's the case, then, you know, that does take time. We can't just say we're going to pull up this track and you're done, right? But if it has been abandoned, then it should be able to have the track removed from it. But there's also, it depends if it's industry track, for example. So a lot of times what you see in smaller communities is there was an agreement for industry track that comes off of the main line for us to serve an elevator or another customer. And there's probably an agreement, industry track agreement, that the elevator owned the track and maintained the track that comes off of the railroad. So it's we'll have to look at what the exact location is to understand what's going on there. But if it has been abandoned, it should be able to be removed.
Yeah, just from our farmers that I've worked at, we talked to, it's in the middle of like a quarter of a field. It splits it just at this goofy angle, and there's no rail, and it's just built up still, and they can't spray it, they can't mow it, they can't service it.
Yeah.
So
in that instance, sorry if I could, I mean, if it, we have a process where, for example, if it's an abandoned line from a predecessor railroad and there's literally, no track connecting it to anywhere, then we should look at it. And if it's something that they want to purchase, there's, if it's land that is in downtown Fargo that we own, we have a lot of trouble with that, right? Because we're trying to keep the capacity from our active rail line. If it's in the middle of someplace where we're not connecting to a main line like our Staples subdivision running through the state, or the Jamestown subdivision, for example. If they want to buy the land from us, we have a whole process for that too. But I'll give you my card and we can talk about the specifics for that.
And then my other one would be the hope for it for farmers in our area is we can't compete on basis with the I-states. And so if we can get, if that efficiency is coming through and we can see some dollars added on to our bushels and stuff, I think we can see more support for anything that gets our basis a lot shorter and be able to compete with things that ship out of Louisiana and everything if we're shipped.
Yeah.
Well, I think that kind of brings us to the conclusion of our panel. Let's give our panelists a hand. I'm going to turn over to Kale. He's got a couple of announcements on some upcoming events.
Yeah.
Just want to.
Sorry about that. So just for everybody's information, we have our next Eggs and Issues series will be on the NSF Farms Engine Award that our region just received. So that'll be very relevant to this committee to kind of hear more about the grant and kind of dive into that. And then obviously we have our kind of our day at the Capitol next week, Voices of Vision, where we'll bring in Chris Gardner from the Pursuit of Happiness. He'll be in our region on the 18th of April. And then the committee calendar is below as it shows on the agenda. So the 17th, looking at talking about egg markets, and then of April, and then June 19th, talking about workforce and labor, things like that. So just continue to stay up to date on emails, things like that. Just really appreciate everybody that made it here this morning. I know it was a little treacherous for some, but and then Amy, really appreciate you making it all the way. I know it's a significant drive for you, so just appreciate you making it here. So
Thanks for having me. It was great.
yeah. Other than that, that's all I have. So
Thanks everyone for attending this morning, and look forward to seeing you at future events with the committee. Have a great day.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Hey, by the way, pencil in June. We're still planning out program and then other.
Oh, good. Okay. June 12th.
Can I just stay here for the rest of the day?
Plenty of food.
I might have to actually.
Yeah, you might be trapped.
It's gonna melt by what, Thursday? Yeah.
That's great. Okay, perfect. Yeah, make sure, I'm guessing that we probably, would want to have my boss or.
March 5th. the next Tuesday.
No, this is really good. It's always like conversation.
Yes, usually the defense.
Great to have people know what they're talking about, like moderate versus.
No, I feel like.
Exactly, that's nothing to do with what we're talking about.
Yep, been there.
I know, right? You're just like.
When you're on the receiving end.
I know.
Oh, yeah, I can.
Yeah. How do I say what I want to say and not answer that question?
Exactly.
Take care. So where is that you're talking about?
The one was, it's, I was trying to find it on the map. There's one south of Agribusiness.
Yeah.
And then there's one by Hannah. And I was trying to find it and it just, the way it's at, it was just right across the field. And they own this and they own this. But he said the same, there's the issue with there's the east.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
Joe, great to see you.
so that's what it's.
Have they worked it all?
I can't remember who he's.
I don't
haven't talked to him in
A few years.
I don't know off the top of my head, because Cooperstown is probably not a. Pittsburgh.
Yeah, hopefully.
See, yeah, I'll reach out.
Can you email me? I'm happy to look into it.
Yeah. I talked to him about.
Todd, how you been?
Yeah, it was just, we were.
Yeah. When's a podcast?
Well, the.
Yeah.
Always without having to put a good opinion, that's what not.
Not today.
Polly.
Easy.
And then they'll be.
You can start.
You
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like,
That's exactly
it's a town with the elevators, and that's, they told the railway. They said it could be.
Would be that they own that track, and then a lot of times what happens is they actually.